It was late, too late to be driving on some nowhere road like Route 17, but I was coming back from a friend's place, a little get-together upstate, and I thought, I'll take the back roads. It'll be faster, no traffic, just me and the open road, but my car, this old Chevy I'd been too stubborn to replace, it had other plans, and I heard it before I felt it. This sputter, this choking sound, like the engine was gasping, and then nothing. Just silence, dead silence, except for the crickets chirping outside and the wind whispering through the trees, and I was stuck, right there in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no houses, just the road stretching out into the dark like it was leading straight to nothing. And I checked my phone. Of course I checked my phone. But there was no signal. Not a single bar. Just that mocking little no service message staring back at me. And I remember the panic. This tight, clawing feeling in my chest. Because what do you do? What do you do when you're alone like that? With nothing but the dark and the woods and the cold. I sat there for a while. I don't know how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe more, trying to think, trying to figure out my next move. And I thought, okay, I'll flag someone down. Someone's got to come by eventually. And sure enough, I saw headlights, faint at first. Just a glow on the horizon, but they got closer, brighter, and I felt this rush of relief. You know, that kind where you can finally breathe again, because help was coming, help was here, and I got out, waving my arms, shouting, even though I knew they couldn't hear me yet. And the vehicle slowed down. This beat-up old tow truck, rusted all over, with a faded sign on the side that said, Hank's Auto and Tow. And the driver, this big guy with a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years, rolled down the window and just looked at me. Didn't say anything at first, just stared. And I remember his eyes, pale, almost colorless, like they were made of glass, and it made my skin crawl, but I pushed it down. I had to, because I needed help. I needed to get out of there. So I ignored the way my gut was screaming at me to run, to just grab my stuff and take my chances in the woods, because what was I going to do? Walk 20 miles in the dark with no signal, no nothing. He finally spoke. His voice rough, like he'd smoked a pack a day for decades, and he said, "Car trouble." Not a question, just a statement, like he already knew, and I nodded, stammering something about the engine dying, and he didn't say anything else, just got out and started hooking my car up to the tow, and I stood there, watching him, noticing the way his hands moved, slow, too slow, like he was dragging out every motion, and I saw the scars on his knuckles, these jagged white lines that looked like they'd been carved into his skin, and I thought, what happened to you? What kind of life have you lived? But I didn't ask. I couldn't, because there was this feeling, this heaviness, like the air was pressing down on me, and I swear I heard something. This faint, scratching sound, like nails on metal, coming from the woods, and I turned to look, but there was nothing, just shadows, just the trees swaying in the wind, and I told myself, it's nothing, it's just the wind, but I didn't believe it, not really. We drove in silence, me in the passenger seat of his truck, my car trailing behind us, bouncing on the tow hook like a corpse, and the cab smelled like stale cigarettes and grease and something else. Something sharp, metallic, like blood, and I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake it, and the radio was on, but it wasn't playing music, just static. This low, crackling static that seemed to hum, like it was alive, and I glanced at him, at Hank, if that was even his name, and he was staring straight ahead, his hands tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched, and I thought, maybe he hears it too. Maybe he knows what it's saying, but I didn't ask. I didn't dare, because something told me I didn't want to know. Something told me to keep my mouth shut and just get through this. Just get my car fixed and get out. We pulled into the auto shop maybe 30 minutes later, this run-down little place off the highway, surrounded by empty fields and a few twisted, barren trees that looked like they'd been dead for years. And the sign out front said, Hank's Auto. Same as the truck, but the letters were peeling. The paint cracked and faded, and there was a single light on inside. This flickering fluorescent glow that buzzed like a dying insect, casting these long, jagged shadows across the gravel lot. And I got out, my boots crunching on the ground, and the air was cold. So cold it stung my lungs. But there was something else, this smell. Not just oil, but something sour, something wrong, like meat left out too long, and I gagged. I couldn't help it. But Hank didn't seem to notice. He just started unhooking my car, his movements slow and mechanical, like he was on autopilot. And I stood there, hugging myself, trying to shake the feeling that I'd made a terrible mistake, trying to tell myself, it's fine, it's just a shop, he's just a mechanic. But I didn't believe it, not for a second. Inside the shop, it was worse, so much worse. The air was thick with that smell, oil, and rot, and something I couldn't place. And the walls were lined with tools, wrenches, and screwdrivers and saws. But they weren't clean. They were rusted, some of them stained with these dark, brownish streaks that I didn't want to think about. And there was a calendar on the wall, this old, faded thing with a pinup girl, but it was from 1992. And the edges were curled, the colors washed out, like no one had touched it in decades. And I thought, how long has this place been here? How long has he been here? And I looked at Hank, who was bent over my car, his back to me, and I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a stain on the back of his shirt, this dark, wet stain that looked fresh, and I told myself it was oil. It had to be oil, but I knew it wasn't. I knew it was something else, and I felt sick. I felt so sick. But I couldn't leave. My car was in pieces. And where would I go? Where could I go with no signal, no way to call for help? The lights flickered again. Harder this time, and for a moment, the whole shop went dark, just for a second, but it was enough for me to hear it, this sound, this low, guttural growl that wasn't human, that wasn't anything I'd ever heard before, and it was coming from that door, that locked door, and when the lights came back on, Hank was closer. Too close, standing right in front of me, his face inches from mine, and I could smell him, this mix of sweat and grease and that metallic tang. And his eyes, those gray, lifeless eyes, they were staring into me. And he said, "You don't want to go back there." And I nodded. I nodded so fast I thought my head would snap off, because I didn't. I didn't want to go back there. I didn't want to know what was behind that door, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop hearing that growl over and over, like it was echoing in my skull. I sat down on this rickety old chair in the corner, trying to breathe, trying to think, and I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were stains on the floor, these dark, sticky stains that led to the back of the shop, to that door. And I thought, what is this place? What have I walked into? And I pulled out my phone again. Still no signal, but I thought, maybe there's a landline, maybe there's a phone here I can use. So I looked around, trying to be subtle, trying not to let Hank see me looking. And I saw it, this old rotary phone on the counter, covered in dust like it hadn't been touched in years. And I thought, that's my way out. That's how I call the cops. That's how I get help. But I couldn't just walk over there. Not with Hank watching. Not with that scratching, that growling. So I waited. I waited for my chance, trying to act normal, trying to act like I wasn't scared out of my mind. The night dragged on, and I don't know how I didn't run. I don't know how I stayed there, but I did. I stayed. Because I kept telling myself, I need my car. I need to call for help. I need to get out of here. And then I heard it again. That scratching, louder this time, more frantic, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. So I stood up, my legs shaking, and I said, I need to use the bathroom. Because I needed an excuse. I needed to move, to get closer to that phone. And Hank didn't look at me. He just pointed to a hallway on the other side of the shop, and I walked. I walked as fast as I could without running, because I didn't want him to know how scared I was. But I was terrified. I was so terrified, and the hallway was dark, so dark, and the air was colder there, damp, like a basement. And I saw it, another door, this one wooden, with a sign that said, restroom. But there was something else, something scratched into the wall next to it, and it said, don't open the door. And my heart stopped, because which door? The bathroom door? The metal door? What door? And I heard the scratching again, and this time, it was coming from the bathroom. I didn't go in. I couldn't. I turned around and walked back to the main room, my hands shaking, my whole body trembling, and Hank was still there, still working, but he looked different now. His movements were jerky, like he was angry, like he was fighting something. And I sat back down, I sat and I watched him, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a key on the counter, a small, rusted key, and it looked like it would fit the padlock on that metal door. And I thought, I could take it. I could open the door and see what's back there. But I didn't want to. I didn't want to know, but I had to. I had to know because the not knowing was worse, the wondering was worse. And I thought, if I can get to the phone, if I can call the cops, maybe I can find out. Maybe I can get help. So I waited. I waited until he turned his back, until he was focused on the engine, and I reached out, my hand shaking. And I grabbed the key, I grabbed it, and I stuffed it in my pocket, and then I moved to the counter, to the phone, and I picked it up, my hands trembling so bad I could barely hold it, and I dialed 911. I dialed and I waited, but there was no dial tone, just silence, dead silence. And I thought, oh God, it's not working, it's not working. And I slammed the phone down, harder than I meant to. And Hank turned. He turned and he looked at me, and his eyes, those pale, dead eyes, they were locked on me. And he said, "Phone's been out for years." And I felt my stomach drop, because how did he know I was trying to call someone? I sat back down, my heart pounding, my mind racing, and I thought, I need to get out of here. I need to leave. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not without my car. Not without a way to call for help. And then Hank stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Need a part. Gotta go to the shed." And he walked out. He walked out into the night. And I was alone. Alone in that shop with the flickering lights and the scratching and the smell. And I knew this was my chance. My only chance. So I stood up, my legs like jelly, and I walked to the metal door, the key burning a hole in my pocket. And I stood there, listening to the scratching, to the growling. And I thought, I can't do this. I can't, but I had to. I had to know. Because if I didn't, I'd never stop wondering. I'd never stop hearing that sound in my head. So I took the key out, I slid it into the padlock, and I turned it, the lock clicking open with a sound that echoed in the silence, and I pushed the door open. Just a crack, just enough to see, and what I saw, I can't even describe it, but I'll try. I'll try. Because you need to know, you need to see it the way I saw it. It was dark inside, so dark, but there was a light, this faint reddish glow coming from the floor, and the smell was unbearable, like death, like decay, and I saw shapes, these twisted, broken shapes hanging from the ceiling. And they weren't tools, they weren't parts, they were bodies, their skin gray and shriveled, their eyes gone, their mouths open in silent screams. And there was something else, something moving, this thing, this creature. It wasn't human, it couldn't be human. It was tall and thin, with limbs that bent the wrong way, and its skin was black, like oil, like tar. And it turned, and it looked at me, and its eyes were red, glowing red, and it growled, that same growl I'd heard. And I screamed and I slammed the door shut. I slammed it and I ran. I ran to the front of the shop. I ran to my car, but it wasn't fixed. It wasn't ready. And I heard the door, the metal door. I heard it creak open behind me, and I heard footsteps. Not human footsteps, but something else. Something heavy. Something wrong. And I turned, and I saw it. I saw that thing coming toward me, its mouth open, its teeth sharp and jagged. And I thought, this is it. This is how I die. But then I heard the truck. I heard the tow truck pulling back into the lot, and the thing stopped. It stopped, and it hissed. This horrible wet hiss. And it turned, and it disappeared back into the darkness. And Hank walked in. He walked in, and he saw the door, the open door, and his face changed. It twisted into something I can't describe. And he said, "I told you not to go back there." And I ran. I ran past him. I ran into the night. I ran into the fields. I ran until my legs gave out, until I couldn't run anymore, and I hid. I hid in the tall grass, and I waited. I waited until the sun came up, until I heard the sound of another car on the highway, and I flagged it down, this old guy in a pickup truck, and I begged him to take me to the nearest town. I begged him, and he did. He drove me to this little gas station about 10 miles away, and I finally got a signal, finally, and I called the cops. I called 911, and I told them everything. I told them about the shop, about Hank, about the bodies, about that thing, and they said they'd send someone out. They said they'd check it out, but I could hear it in their voice. They didn't believe me. They thought I was crazy, and I sat there at that gas station waiting for them to call me back, waiting for news, but they never did. Not that day, not the next. I went home. I went back to my place, and I tried to move on. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it. So a week later, I called the sheriff's office. I called to follow up, and they told me. They told me they'd gone to the shop. They'd found it, but it was empty, abandoned, like no one had been there in years. And there was no sign of Hank, no sign of any bodies, no sign of anything. And they said, "Maybe you got the wrong place." But I didn't. I know I didn't. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that place wasn't empty. Not that night. Not when I was there. And I still hear it. I still hear that scratching, that growl in my dreams, in the quiet moments. And I still smell, that rot, that death. And I wonder what it was, what Hank was, what that place was. And I wonder if it's still out there, if it's still waiting for someone else to break down on Route 17, waiting for someone else to walk into that shop. And I don't know, I'll never know, but I know one thing: I'll never drive that road again. I'll never stop at a place like that again.